Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for coming along on this really cold evening. The Immigrant Queen. I should make it clear, this is a novel. I write novels mainly now, and this is number 5. The others are really set in the background of social science issues, the context of modern slavery or tax avoidance in the City of London. I really wanted to write a novel then that had the hero who was a tax inspector, because there aren't any heroes that are tax inspectors in literature in the UK. There's one in Australia, I found. This is a classical novel. Now, I had a classical education, for which I'm extremely grateful, at a state school, which you could get in those days. And I had a wonderful teacher who was really interested in classical literature, and particularly in drama. So from his point of view, the problem was to get us over the hurdle of learning the language as quickly as possible, so we could do play readings, which we did, which was wonderful. And I went off to university to do classics, and there all they were interested in was the grammar and the ethic dative, and why Euripides used the particular forms he did in these fragments. And there are so many fragments of Euripides that have been found that have obscure usages in. So I gave up classics, went into philosophy, and then later into social science. But I've always been interested in the classical world, as many people are, and this is really my revenge on my classical education, if you like, writing novels about it, because ancient Greece was a mass of contradictions, and it retains its fascination for us. How many of you have been to the Parthenon? Yeah, goodly showing. Well, that's 8.5 million people a year, roughly, visit the Parthenon now. And it's been a staple, I suppose, of intellectual holidays and intellectual coming of age since the 18th century, since the Grand Tour got going in that part of the world. How many of you have been to the British Museum? Up there, you can see it with it, you've all been there. And everyone takes their children, and in my case, grandchildren, to furnish their education with it. The British Museum has 55 rooms and galleries. If you look at the plan online, of those, it's 26, or is it 27? I can't remember. Just a bit under half are devoted to the classical world, almost all of them to ancient Greek artifacts, in fact, just 2 on the classical Roman ones. Compare that with the Indus civilization, for example, which has half a showcase devoted to it. It's quite difficult to find. Or the Americas, which have 1 gallery for both North and South America. Now, this, of course, is the heritage that the British Museum has, and that dictates what they can display. But it's a very striking image of the development of our culture. And you can see the crash barriers in front of the British Museums with the mobs trying to get in. 5.5 million people a year, roughly, major tourism destination, and so on. And of course, ancient Greece retains its fascination, and it retains its cultural fascination. I'm sure you all know about the novels, modern trope, set in ancient Greece, novels of serious novelists like Pat Barker, Margaret Atwood, and others, right through to popular romances of people like Jennifer Saint. And so many of these novels deal with modern issues set in the classical world, and to caricature, one ends up with a novel which 21st century women confront Bronze Age men. And of course, the women are interested in their lives, their self-realization, their opportunities and their capacity to be themselves. The men are interested essentially in the glory that they can attain in this world, so they leave an imperishable name as Achilles, for example, did, and the glory, honour, status of their clan. So you have this this contradiction, which gives you a lot to write about. I wonder how many of you before this evening had heard of Aspasia, subject of my novel. People heard of her? It's very interesting. She's a remarkable person. We don't know a great deal about her, but we do know some things. She's mentioned by Xenophon, by Thucydides, actually mentioned once by Herodotus. She's mentioned in Diodorus Siculus. Plutarch wrote quite a bit about her. So there's quite a lot of references to her. And we do know some references in records of Athens, in court records and elsewhere, which I'll come on to. She was a remarkable person by any accounts. She was, in her time, at the height of Athenian glory in the 5th century BCE, the leading woman in Athens, partner to Pericles, the leading statesman, and a considerable contributor in her own right. She wrote philosophical dialogues, and we don't have any of the dialogues because nobody actually copied them out, but we do have fragments of them quoted by other philosophers with respect. So she was obviously taken seriously as a philosopher. She was a teacher, there's quite a lot of evidence of that. She's referred to as a speechwriter to Pericles, and that is the pinnacle of speech writing in Athens. She was also renowned as a beauty, as a wit, and she's the centre of a cluster of legends and myths which get less and less tangible as you move out from the centre. So she's a great subject for a novel, and she has had comparatively little attention. Well, the thing that I learned, I suppose, as my classical education progressed, but particularly after I finished my school level education, which was really centred on Greek culture and particularly on Athenian culture, about the complexity of ancient civilizations. Athens, leading civilization, is sort of textbook example of civilization and high culture versus brutality. It's a great intellectual centre, a centre of culture, a cradle of civilization, if you like, a place which brought together, contributed to the development of philosophy that is still used by philosophers, the writing of history, drama, poetry, and so on. But it was also a brutal imperialist state that created an empire and put down revolts, and there were revolts by the larger members of the empire from time to time with enormous savagery. It's a society which, of course, had many status divisions beyond those between men who were dominant and women who were largely confined to the home. It's a slave-owning society. I'll say a bit more about that later. But it's a society in which there were gradations between Athenians, who are obviously superior to everyone else, other Greeks, other Greeks resident in Athens, immigrants, and Aspasia, whatever else she was certainly not an Athenian, and quite possibly not a Greek, certainly an immigrant, which makes the impact she had on Athenian society all the more remarkable. And then below them, the mass of slaves and different gradations of slaves. And Aspasia's life was, if you like, one of contradictions. And the stories that are told about her display these contradictions. This is really why I found them interesting, because you can tell her life And sorry, I should show you an image of Aspasia. That's cover of the book. That's a copy, actually in the Vatican now, a Roman copy, probably of a Greek statue, probably of Aspasia, probably carved several hundred years after she was alive, definitely not from life. So it's some kind of representation. And at the end, we have Aspasia from the fresco on the wall of the University of Athens, just off Syntagma Square. So she is still remembered there. But Aspasia, her story can be told in terms of her intellect, of Aspasia as a philosopher, speechwriter, and so on, or in terms of her femininity as a wife and as a mother. She came to Athens in the 450s BCE. We're not quite sure when exactly, but it's not quite clear who she was. One version that you get in later writers is that she was a distant relative of Pericles from Miletus, the city on the coast of Turkey, Asia Minor, very highly developed area in the ancient Greek world, and a place, crucially, where women were educated, or high-status women received high-level education. They didn't in Athens. They found it very difficult to get education. And one version is she came in the train of a relative of Pericles who was coming to Athens to get married. And that's how she came to Athens and then made her mark. Another version is that she's the daughter of Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus. Halicarnassus is another city in western Turkey, a bit back from the coast, a Greek city with Greek culture, and Artemisia was one of a line of Artemisias who was queen of Halicarnassus, and of course subservient at that time, the early years of the 5th century BCE, to the Persian Empire. And the Second Persian War, when Xerxes decided to obliterate these rather irritating Greeks on the western fringe of his empire, who kept encouraging and supporting revolts against his power, sent a huge army and fleet to wipe out, effectively, any Greek opposition. And after various adventures, Artemisia was a hands-on monarch. She led a flotilla of 5 ships in the massive fleet he sent. Well, that fleet was much depleted at, what's it called? It's actually called Artemisium on the east coast of Greece, about halfway down, where they unfortunately anchored and were heavily damaged in a storm. Their ships were rather large and unwieldy. When you got the wind blowing them, they crashed into each other. They could do an awful lot of damage. If they're crashing into the enemy, that was okay. But if you lost control at night, you could lose a lot of ships, particularly since many of them were galleys, as well as sail-propelled. I've got an image of some here. There's some Greek equivalents. The Persian versions were a bit bigger. And I've lost completely the thread of what I was saying about the Battle of Artemisium. Oh yes, there's another subject for novels, but I haven't found many novels about it, about the story of why the Persian fleet before that battle was so heavily damaged. The story of Hydra. Hydra was a sponge diver, and there's a certain amount of evidence of this. He's mentioned in Herodotus, in other writers. And she possibly, with her dad, swam underwater and cut the anchor cables. And there is evidence of her being in that area. So it's possible she cut the cables of a couple of ships, which were then blown into the others and depleted the fleet. Anyway, fleet wasn't quite as strong as it ought to have been by the time it sailed round to attack the fleet led by the Athenians. The Athenians had the biggest fleet in Greece, far and away, at that time, but there were contributions from other states. And Artemisia was in the Persian fleet, the baddest fleet, according to Herodotus and the Greek point of view. But in the heat of battle, when she noticed which way things were going, i.e. the Greeks were winning, she hastily lowered her Persian flag, put up a Greek flag, and sunk the nearest Persian ship. So this was a smart move, you might say. However, she then put the Persian flag back up and retreated behind the rest of the Persian fleet. Now, Xerxes was watching from a throne on a hillside rather far away. He saw her ship sink another ship. He didn't realise the point about the change of flags, and he didn't realise she'd sunk a Persian ship. So he famously exclaimed, "My women have become men, and my men have become women." And the legend is, which was reported by Herodotus and others, that she became Xerxes' mistress later, among his other mistresses, and bore 2 children, and one of whom might have been Aspasia. So there is a romantic tale. And her history is littered with these kinds of tales. Well, what did she do in Athens? One version is she was a sex worker. She ran a brothel, a high-grade brothel, very successful, became a high-status courtesan, entertaining elite Greeks and elite Athenians at their drinking parties and so on. And she met Pericles by that route. That's the story that people like Aristophanes tell in the play The Arcanians, for example. And that you have to bear in mind that Aristophanes wasn't necessarily a friend of Pericles, though he was a member of Pericles' circle. Aristophanes tended, by background, to come from the aristocratic group in Athens. And the politics, of course, is enormously complicated, and I'm not sure how good my grasp is of it. But Pericles himself was an aristocrat. He was one of the richest aristocrats, in fact, from one of the 5 noble families in Athens. But he sided in his politics in the limited democratic assembly with the workers' parties. The big change that had happened in Athens in the 5th century, of course, politically, was the enormous expansion of naval power and the fleet. And that meant there was a new class of people who built ships, sailed them, and were terrifically important. And that group was expanded, and that was the core of a democratic workers' party. Pericles spotted this and got himself generally into the position of leading them. So he became someone who was a figurehead of that party. Aristophanes, of course, lampoons him in his political satires. The alternative story is she ran a school for girls. In some ways, that's a political act in Athens because women did not receive anything beyond the basic education, or very few women. And she met Pericles as a speechwriter and general intellectual in Socrates' circle, and as a political advisor. And she fell in love with Pericles, he with her. Plutarch, writing 300 years later, certainly, and he's one of the main sources on Aspasia, he writes quite a lot about her. He says so. He says that they never parted in the morning when Pericles went down to the political centre of Athens to pursue his political career, leading the council and making speeches. They never parted without kissing goodbye. How romantic is that? Aristophanes differs. and sees her as mainly supplying prostitutes. Did he divorce his wife for her? He certainly divorced his wife about the time they met. Maybe. His 2 sons by his marriage remained his legitimate heirs, of course. He never married Aspasia because he couldn't, because she was a resident alien, not an Athenian citizen. And he had himself passed or led the passing of a populist law that prevented legitimate marriage between outsiders and Athenians and rendered their children illegitimate. His son, by Aspasia, however, was later legitimized by a special law mentioning this person passed by Pericles. Now, I don't know what that tells you about the respect in which Pericles held Aspasia, but it seems to be true because there are court records of it. She may have been the model, and there are various sources of this, for one of the statues of Athene on the Parthenon. That isn't actually a statue on the Parthenon because we don't have it, but there were 2 statues, or 2 major statues, one outside, the famous statue in which the sun glinted on the spear point because it was sheathed in gold, and you could see that as one of the first sights of Athens from the deck of a ship as you approached the city, and one inside, and it's possibly the one inside which certainly Pericles supervised the construction of as part of his major project of rebuilding Athens. He boasted, "I found Athens a city of wood, and I left it a city of stone." And of course, the Persians earlier had devastated Athens when they conquered that part of Greece in the Second Persian War. That statue is actually from a temple on the western coast of Turkey. But it's to give you, and it's got the wrong kind of column and so on, if anyone's an expert, Corinthian column, which I doubt if you would have had on the Acropolis, but is to give you the idea of what the statue might have looked like. She was a member of Socrates' circle. One version, Plutarch likes this, is that she was the person who is called Diotima in the Symposium. You know, the Symposium, the drinking party, which has got various major Athenian figures in it, including Aristophanes, actually, Alcibiades, Socrates, and so on, in which they discuss love. Diotima, of course, being a woman, isn't allowed to say anything. And there are no lines by her in direct speech in the whole dialogue. However, Socrates does report what she has taught him. And what she has taught him is about platonic love, about non-physical love and respect, an idea which has been important particularly in the early medieval period in Europe, and a concept which was associated with her by Socrates at some length, and which he sees as influential in his philosophy because it fits in with ideas of respect for persons and taking everybody's views on subjects seriously. So was she Diotima? We don't know. The other version is that Diotima was someone called Diotima who was a minor philosopher from a Greek city on the coast of Italy, who may well have been in Athens at that time, but no one's really sure because there's very little evidence about it. And what was her status among philosophers? And there you are, the 2 Aspasias, body and mind. There's Socrates quoted by Plato in the Menexenus. Just takes place at the beginning of it, just after Socrates. Try again. Pericles has delivered his famous funeral oration, and they're discussing this famous speech of terrific importance. I'll say a bit about it in a moment. And Socrates says, "I had no mean teacher, one who taught Pericles, the finest Greek orator, that teacher was Aspasia. So that's Socrates being quoted. Is this Plato mocking Pericles? Plato being a member of the old aristocratic party. And while all these people socialised together, well, Plato was a bit later, so he had been extremely young time that Pericles was alive, but Socrates is reported as socialising with Pericles. They were politically opposed. So is he taking the mickey out of Pericles, saying, gosh, this guy's meant to be a great statesman, but look, he has women writing his speeches. What about that? And there, of course, is a quote from Plutarch about the affection between Pericles and Aspasia. But there you have one version of Aspasia. Aspasia, surrounded by Greek philosophers, may well be Anaxagoras, who's leaning over, wrapped on by her arguments. He certainly had a big beard and is a big imposing guy. And he was a very close friend of Pericles. Here's another version of Aspasia and philosophy. Socrates rescuing Alcibiades, the impressionable young man, from the clutches of Aspasia, represented as a prostitute, sex worker. And there's Socrates with his bald head dragging her away. It's Aspasia as a body or Aspasia as an intellect, very clearly. She certainly wrote dialogues. She's quoted in Xenophon's works. Xenophon wrote voluminously. He wrote one of them is the Memorabilia, where he talks about his life and times in Athens, basically, and various things. He talks about Aspasia and quotes from dialogues. And one version is that it was Aspasia. What Aspasia actually taught Socrates was the inductio, particular argumentative technique, used a lot by Socrates, particularly in the early dialogues, or the elenkos, as it's called in Greek. The technique is a very simple one. You come along, Socrates comes up to you and says, you've got 5 minutes. Yeah, I'd just like to ask you what justice is. And you say, go away, Socrates, I've been here before. Socrates says, no, only take 5 minutes. Just tell me what you think justice is. So you say, oh, very well. Justice is the will of the stronger, or something, as Thrasymachus says. Something like that. And Socrates said, yes, very interesting, thank you for that. Now, suppose this guy here came up, Plato means broad, with his broad shoulders, in brackets, the other version of the bit of his anatomy that was being referred to was his gut, and he was a man with a big pot belly. I don't know which is right. But anyway, Plato comes up with his broad shoulders, punches you on the nose, and steals that very nice gold ring on your finger. Would you see that as fair? And Thrasymachus says, oh, no, I'm not sure about that. So Socrates says, ha-ha, 1 to me. And that is a very simple version of inductio, but it's roughly the one that's used. It's basically a form of argument that consists of interlocution, of dialogue, of getting the other person to take a position and then challenging that position and making progress in that way. So, one version is that what she actually invented was the inductio. And the example that Xenophon quotes is certainly an inductio argument as what her contribution was. So she may have been important. She was a teacher of rhetoric. She taught Pericles public speaking, possibly, or advised him. She may have written the famous funeral oration given in 431 BCE, when Athens was into the second year of the Peloponnesian War, the war against Sparta and her allies, the Athenian Empire, which ultimately led to the destruction of Athens, a nice Greek tale of hubris, overweening arrogance on the part of Athens of getting themselves involved in this war, which they failed to win and resulted in their destruction as an imperial power. And there's Pericles giving his funeral oration in the Kerameikos in the cemetery, a tribute to the soldiers and sailors that Athens had lost in the war. And it's also a great statement of the value of Athens. Athens as a school for Greece, as it says. And it's the claim of Athens to be the leading Greek nation, essentially. And it includes discussions of Athenian society. It says in Athenian society, words to the effect, women are best never spoken of, whether for good or ill, that women are of no importance. So maybe Aspasia wrote that because she thought it was a kind of line that would go down well. Notice there are a few women actually among the men listening to this oration. She was certainly accused of blasphemy round about 438 BCE, which indicates she had a political presence. Now, in ancient Athens, in the court system, you had large juries chosen at random from the citizens. So fairly populist affairs, or they could be. And it was a common way of attacking political opponents to accuse them of a crime or accuse their friends of a crime and then take a lawsuit against them. And Aspasia was vulnerable because she was a foreigner. She could be accused of blasphemy because obviously she worshipped the gods of the city she had come from, who were not Athene. And if you could pin this on her, you can pin a blasphemy charge on her. The penalties for blasphemy include death. Of course, it's very similar to the charge that Socrates was convicted on and later executed. So it's a serious charge and a serious way of getting at your political opponents. Phidias, the famous sculptor, who was a close ally of Pericles in the rebuilding of Athens and the design of the Parthenon and other buildings, died in jail while in the process of being tried on a blasphemy charge. He was a resident alien, an immigrant as well. So it's a serious charge. Well, she was accused of blasphemy. Pericles defended her because, of course, she wasn't allowed to speak in court, being a woman. And he made a passionate oration, finishing up by saying, "Please don't take her away from me," and bursting into tears in public. And sitting there with his head in his hands. This, however, didn't work. According to, well, some versions are, they said, okay, let her off. And that's what happened. That swung the vote in her favour. The other version is that it didn't. So Aspasia, who was present before anyone could stop her, said, "Citizens of Athens, think what you are losing," and stripped off. That's the least prurient image of that I can find. So they all applauded successfully. And she was acquitted. Well, there's a lot more about her, but just mention one other contradiction. And these are all mind-body contradictions. Was it intellectual arguments or sexuality? Now, I'll leave that a moment and go back to Pericles. One argument is that she concerns the origins of the Peloponnesian War. Aristophanes' version in the Acharnians and a couple of other plays is that the war started essentially due to disputes about the import of immigrant sex workers into Athens, into her brothel system. Another version, of course, is that it started essentially because Athens believed it had got to the stage in the development of its empire and its strength where it could take on Sparta and win and finally resolve the question of who was the leading Greek nation. And of course that was a big mistake. Well, she's a rich field for the novelist. I wanted to write her story from her point of view as an outsider in Athenian society, because that would enable you to talk about all the conflicts and contradictions. But actually in the end I found this very difficult to do, because you end up inside the sort of gilded elite cage of the society looking down on everything you want to talk about. You can't get inside it. So I sort of gave that up in the end and wrote much more from the point of view of a slave in her household, same solution that Pat Barker adopts in her recent novel about Cassandra, for example. And one of the greatest contradictions of Greek society was the way they treated their slaves. Athens was a slave society, a population of something over 250,000 at its height, and of that you had 10,000, 12,000 male citizens at the top, who were the people who had authority through the democratic system, were able to vote in and elect leaders and so on, and generals in the assembly. But below them, of course, you had people who weren't citizens. You had resident aliens and immigrants, a big group of those, because Athens was attractive, because it was a rich society. And below that, you had slaves. And slaves, of course, many gradations of slaves. House slaves probably were treated better than other slaves. Slaves working on the large farms were treated pretty harshly. And then slaves who worked in the silver mines, which were essential to Athenian success and economy, and their economy, were treated the worst of all. Find it difficult to find images of slavery in Athens, surprisingly. There's something from a vase of people working in the mines. There were about 20,000 roughly slaves, and we do have quite a few of the contracts where capitalists contracted with the Athenian state, who owned the mines, to provide silver workers. And on the basis of those contracts and how they worked things out and amortized the value of slaves and so on, we think slaves lasted about 4 years in the mines. They were confined underground, included children and women. Many of them came from the imperial expeditions, the punishment raids that Athens ran as a brutal imperial power. Well, there's a quote from Aristotle writing a bit later about what slaves are. Slaves differ little from tame animals. Both serve the needs of others, essentially. They lack a soul, you might say. They lack the intellect, the capacity to make refined decisions and choices that free people, or free men in his world, make. The silver mines, just to backtrack, at the time of the First Persian War, or just before, Athens struck a valuable load of silver at the tip of the peninsula near Laurium. Mind that. What they could have done is just distribute the cash among the Athenian citizens. And that was a popular idea. But Themistocles persuaded them to build ships. And it's a good thing they did, because that's what enabled them essentially to defeat the Persians and assume the leadership role of the Greeks in the Second Persian War. Now, Athens led the league against Persia, which had its treasury on the sacred island of Delos. But in the 460s, they got tired of this, So they expropriated the money and transformed the League into an empire. And of course, the logic was that everybody had to pay contributions and everybody had to trade on the terms set by Athens, because Athens was leading the opposition to Persia and providing security. And if anyone objected, as a number of the larger islands in a position to, like Thasos or Euboea, or centres like Mytilene on Samos, or a few others round in the south in the Cyclades, objected and rejected the Athenians, they were punished, essentially. And that was a good source of slaves. And writing from the point of view of a slave, I'm able to introduce the jeopardy, the risk. Lymander, the slave, is actually a well-educated person. He's a bard in the Homeric tradition, so it enables me to, an entertainer essentially, with a great store of Athenian and Greek culture in his head. So I'm able to introduce a lot of stuff I like writing about, quotations from Greek choruses and so on. But the conditions under which slaves lived varied enormously, as I've said, and the slaves in the silver mines lived miserable lives. Diodorus Siculus says that they were treated atrociously. They were the worst treated slaves in the Greek world. And you always have to remember that, alongside the image of the heights of Athenian culture that is actually founded in this world that relied on slavery. I should have mentioned, but failed to do so, that later in the 5th century BCE, Athens used the silver from the mine to build walls around the port of Piraeus and connecting Piraeus with the city and defending the city. Athens believed itself to be essentially an island, invulnerable to attack on land, because it could just sit there, and if someone like the Spartans, for example, were to attack them, well, the Spartans, as a society resting on the labour of helots, who were the oppressed group of serfs, always dreaded a revolt by the helots. If their army went off to Athens, the helots would probably revolt, and the army would have to skedaddle back home to sort that out. So you felt pretty safe inside your walls. And that's one reason why Athens felt able to start a war with with Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars, a war which it ultimately lost after various adventures. So silver was important, and the slaves in the silver mines were important. And from the point of view of my hero, who tells the story of Athens and the story of Aspasia, is that always there is a threat as a slave. If he doesn't please people, if he offends someone, he can be kicked out, he can be sold, likely sold to the silver mines, and that'll be the end of him. So everywhere there is this dread hanging over the world, and I think that's something that is a reality about Athenian society as I see it. You had some very secure groups, but you had a lot of very insecure people. Well, that's really the background to my novel. Oh yeah, that's another reference to Aspasia. Aspasia, actually, if you look it up on library indexes, there is a Central Eastern, Southeastern European yearbook of feminist writing that's called Aspasia. So she is remembered there. But my book, I have my book, and it's available at a cost of £5, just under half price. It's available at cost price if you want it. But that is entirely up to you. And thank you for listening to these ramblings. But you can see why Aspasia is a fascinating subject.
Thank you. said you'd be willing to answer one or two questions if
Oh,
anybody had
course.
anything. Is there any comments or questions anyone would like to ask? Please,
Yes,
Alex.
thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Obviously, from forgive my ignorance, but from what you said about Aspasia, there are many different versions of her life.
Yeah.
What of her death?
We
What do
don't know.
understand? Do we know anything about? Are there any versions of her?
No,
passing?
we don't know when she died. I mean, I stopped writing, I stopped my story about her in the early years of the Peloponnesian War. We know Pericles died of the plague. That was the Achilles heel of Athens, of course. Everybody inside the walls, no knowledge of modern diseases. Probably typhoid broke out, ultimately killed something like a third of the population and massively weakened them. Pericles himself died of the plague, and Aspasia married a prominent general, Athenian general, a bit later, and had a son by this chap as well. He later died of the plague as well, so have a good track record. And we don't really know what became of Aspasia after that. She died around about 400, 399, people think.
Is that because she disappears from the record at that point?
Yes, yeah. So we don't know.
Please.
I wanted to ask. Thank you. Is that, yes, that's working. Not so much about Aspasia, but Athenian society and the things you were talking about towards the end of the lecture about slavery. Slavery, of course, is a very hot topic in historical writing nowadays, and I think in the early modern historiography, particularly, we're talking much more nowadays about forced labour rather than slavery, because slavery means different things at different times, doesn't it? And I think you're partly implying that in what you said about Greek history. I wanted to ask you really about racial slavery, the point that Robin Blackburn makes in the first of his big books. I think it's called Baroque Slavery, whatever it's called, anyhow, Robin Blackburn's big book on early modern slavery. And the big point he makes in that book is to say that what distinguishes European slavery, particularly the Caribbean, African-Caribbean slave trade in the long 18th century, is that it really is racial slavery. And people like David Starkey say, slavery is as old as history itself. We've always had slavery. We've had slavery in the ancient world. But, Robin's argument is really very specific, that it takes a quite different turn as practiced by Europeans in the early modern period. It was racialized slavery. Now, I take it that this was not the case in the ancient world to the same degree, but I don't know about it. It's not my period, and it's become your period. And I wonder what you think about that, really, because different grades, aren't there, of as you said, in Athenian slavery, really.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. To some extent racialised, but racialised along different categories that I think we would think about, and not so much on black, white, or ethnic categories. But the lower grade slaves tended to be non-Greeks, but they weren't all non-Greeks. There certainly were Greeks working in the silver mines, and we know that from the names. And they were people who were captured in punishment raids on Greek cities.
But that's different. This is the point that Robin Blackburn makes. It's one thing to enslave your enemies captured in battle, but that's a different thing from transporting halfway across the world.
Yeah, very much.
Because they're black. That's there's a big difference between one is quite decisively racial.
Yeah, so it's not racialised in that sense. But certainly different racial groups had different status in Greek societies. The other interesting issue, though, is the idea that's associated with Aristotle and others, that slaves were fundamentally different because they lacked the capacity to make choice. Now, how you get from the fact that you happen to capture them in a battle to they lack the capacity to make choice, I'm not really sure. I don't see it. They physically lack the capacity to make choice because they're confined and controlled. But if they weren't controlled, surely they would be as able to manage life in an Athenian assembly as the Athenians were.
Am I right in saying that the distinction with Roman slavery was that it was possible to get out of it in a sense after a period of time?
Yeah, a
Whereas
manumission.
in Greek slavery, it was for life almost.
It was for life.
Too simplistic?
Yes, that's true. And for Greeks, of course, breeding slaves was an activity that people, some people went in for. If you've got slaves, you can breed more slaves, hooray. This is a growth model sort of thing. Yes, I mean, the legal status of slaves, and slaves could acquire money in Rome, couldn't they, and buy their way out. And there's a whole litigation, I don't know the details of it, about how much you had to pay and what was a fair price. That's valuing of slaves.
Well, that's I'm just fascinated. I found the whole thing fascinating. There seem to be two juxtapositions. One is the courtesan, highly sexualised, and the other is of the intellect, feminist, intelligent, a teacher. You have studied her. In your opinion, was she both? Or was she the intellect who was sexualised in memory by her enemies? Or was she the courtesan who was intellectualised to justify her existence by those who were enamoured by her?
I think there's enough evidence that she was an intellectual, particularly Xenophon, who's serious, quoting her dialogues. I think she wrote those dialogues. Whether she actually invented the inductio, I don't know, but she was probably around while people were thinking about that and discussing how you had that kind of argument and probably contributing seriously. But she's also someone who uses her sexuality in order to advance herself in Athenian society. For goodness sake, what else are you going to do if you're a woman?
Well, she set a good precedent which has been followed by many others, I think.
Yeah.
So can I thank you publicly for that, just to say that we will be retiring to the bar in Keynes, and if you're able to join us, we can. But also replug the book, if I may. A bargain. It's at the cost price, and so if people would like to buy the book at £5, was it you said?
Yes, £5.
£5.
I have a stock. I have a bag full.
Yes. So,
Gosh, that I should descend to this.
I can assure you I'm going to buy the first copy, so I'm sure I'll get one. Okay.
Right.
Okay. And ask if you could sign it for me. I'd be grateful.
Well, possibly reduces the value.
And